In this week's episode of the Brisbane Property Podcast, we have invited back Terry Ryder, the director of Hotspotting, and we have some very big news about Brisbane that we are going to be sharing with you as an exclusive on this week's episode. We hope you enjoy today's podcast.
Welcome to the Brisbane Property Podcast with your hosts Melinda and Scott Jennison.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Brisbane Property Podcast with Scott and Melinda Jennison, and we've got a guest on today, Terry Ryder from Hotspotting. Welcome, Terry.
Thanks very much. Lovely to be here. Love talking about real estate, and we're starting a new year about which we are excited, and we think it's going to be a great year for real estate, particularly in Brisbane and Queensland. As I'll perhaps discuss as we get into the conversation, we do rate both Brisbane and regional Queensland very highly on a national level for 2025.
Thanks for joining us again, Terry. And for those listeners that are regulars of the Brisbane Property Podcast, you may recall we last spoke to Terry back in, when was it? July last year, 2024, episode number 215, for anyone that wants to have a review of some of the topics that we discussed back at that time. Because at that time, you had predicted that Brisbane was ranked number one in terms of Australia's real estate rising star of 2024. So we thought we'd invite you back onto the podcast to really unpack, did we perform the way you had expected? Take a deep dive into, not just what's happened in the last year but also what's likely to happen in the future. Because as property investors, let's face it, we're more interested in moving forward because we can't, invest retrospectively. But of course, the story of the past can often tell us information that is important for us in terms of selecting locations for the future. And you are the expert in hotspotting, Terry. So, we're really privileged to have you back on the podcast, and we look forward to extracting some valuable information for our listeners today.
Okay, looking forward to it.
Terry, I apologise. I probably should have said welcome back and not welcome, because it is great to have you back. Obviously, the founder of Hotspotting, and you're renowned for identifying property growth in hotspots across Australia, as Melinda touched on, ranking Brisbane as a rising star. How have you seen it perform in the past year, Terry?
It performed pretty much as we had hoped and expected. We did. You're referring to a report we do at this time every year with Canstar, the comparison website, and we rank the 14 major market jurisdictions across Australia. That's 8 capital cities and 6 state regional markets, using 5 different metrics, and then we aggregate the rankings and come up with an overall ranking. This time last year, Brisbane was our number one. As it turned out, probably you would say that in terms of price growth in 2024, it was number 2, but it's not a bad outcome. It was Perth led on price growth, but Brisbane pretty close behind, with Adelaide also doing well. But in actual fact, those 3 cities were really outperformers, because if you look across all the markets, particularly the capital city markets in 2024, not many of them actually had very strong years, and some like Melbourne had prices declining a little bit. But Brisbane had double-digit growth, both for houses and units in 2024. So it has performed really well, and we think it's going to continue to do so.
What do you think's, driving the demand for Brisbane property, Terry? I mean, we know that there's a shortage of listings in Brisbane, which is something that is prevalent across other capital city markets that have outperformed in the last 12 months, including Perth and Adelaide. But what's the demand? What are the demand drivers at the moment that you've been seeing for Brisbane?
There's a couple of big ones. Brisbane and Queensland benefit more than any other part of Australia from internal migration, which is a big factor. We do have that trend that we have called the exodus to affordable lifestyle, and Queensland's been a target for lifestyle and climate, although I'm not so sure that the Brisbane climate's been so great just lately, but
it's been a lot of rain, hasn't there?
There is that perception, and so population growth is a big factor, but also infrastructure spend. We always believe that is a big generator of economic activity and therefore jobs and therefore demand for real estate. Brisbane has a lot going on in that regard. In 2024, projects that were completed or were under construction across Greater Brisbane, infrastructure projects, not including residential developments, totaled almost $50 billion, one of the highest rankings in the country, and that's a big generator. So when you've got that level of demand being generated at a time when listings are incredibly low. And as I know you know, listings are at historically low levels in Brisbane at a time of very high demand. Looking at the material from SQM Research, the lowest it's right now, the lowest it's been in at least the last 15 years. And typically you might have 30,000 or more homes for sale across Greater Brisbane. But what we've seen in the last, say, 2 to 3 years is less than 20,000 at any one time. Right now, it's under 15,000. So very low levels of supply at a time of rising demand. So that's obviously putting pressure on prices.
Yeah, it certainly is. And, I think that, as property investment experts, I think you and I both love studying property markets. And I know we've just recently recorded an episode on the listing volumes at a suburb level here in Brisbane. And there's some really surprising trends in terms of which areas have more properties available for sale and some of the reasons why that might be. But you're the expert of hotspotting, and I'd love to sort of understand a little bit more about the growth indicators that you look for. So as an investor, are there any specific growth indicators that they should be looking for when identifying growth areas in Brisbane?
Yeah, well, we look very closely at underlying economies. We think that real estate markets are local in nature and that they arise out of local economies. And that starts to explain why we have all these regional differences. We had markets in 2024 like Brisbane that had boom level price growth and some where it was pretty moderate and some where prices fell. So underlying economy is really important because that's where the jobs come from and that's where the economic activity and therefore demand for real estate happen. We also are a big believer in infrastructure as a generator of property demand, both existing infrastructure, so good basic amenities and services in an area, but also in particular new infrastructure development, because that can be a huge game changer. An example that suddenly popped into my head was the rail link to the Redcliffe Peninsula, and I think there's no doubt that that market has been transformed, not just by that, but that certainly was a big factor in making that area more popular, and that's a market that's really progressed in recent years with that as a major factor. But more at street level, it really does come down to basics. We do believe that there are people who are either renting or buying property are looking for proximity to schools, shops, transport, perhaps lifestyle features like a high street with cafe culture or green spaces. So those basic things, I think, is what both tenants and buyers look for.
Yeah, it's a really good perspective. And of course, getting an understanding of what locals wants will help investors also to select those areas that that may appeal more to locals and not just, what might appeal to the investor who may live in another state where in fact the demands and things that they might be looking for in a property might be different. A classic example for us is with a lot of investors that say, look, I'd really prefer brick and tile in my investment property. And of course, here in Brisbane, there's so many homes that are not brick and tile, and we need to then educate around the different product types that might be used in building certain properties and different suburbs that are predominantly brick and tile versus other suburbs that might be predominantly tin and timber or weatherboard homes. So, it's getting an understanding of, how locals like to live and, what local suburbs look like, and then applying those lifestyle overlays that you've talked about, proximity to schools, cafes, precincts that give people accessibility to the Queensland way of living. And that's ultimately what buyers are looking for.
Absolutely. There was an interesting study that I read in detail last year, and it was actually a study by Infrastructure Victoria, but I think that the principles apply equally to other cities. And it was really looking at what does proximity to certain features, what impact does they have on price? And it found that locations that were within walking distance of certain features, of which kind of like the high street was a very, very big factor. So by that, I mean the main street that's got cafes and shops and perhaps government services and maybe public transport close by as well. Those were big factors in driving. Proximity to those sorts of features were really big. Also, obviously, schools and shops. Interestingly, it found that was likely that apartments are more likely to be really well located for that reason than houses in suburbs. But that's another fact we may talk about a little bit more, because that's certainly part of the Brisbane market, the trend of more and more people actually opting for attached rather than detached dwellings.
Yeah, surprise to many of us, but we will get to that because I think that's a really important topic about Brisbane.
Terry, I know we've touched on, and it's an area I love talking about, is infrastructure, and I will jump back to it in a second. But are there any emerging sort of suburbs or regions or property types, for example? I know you touched on the units as well, that you believe are set for growth in 2025 and beyond?
Well, yeah, units do stand out because that's one of the game changers that we've observed as a national trend, but particularly in our biggest cities. And it's not just about affordability, it's also lifestyle. There are more and more cohorts that are opting for that. Downsizers are a very big force, a growing force in the market. We do have an aging population. And I downsized recently myself, in fact, from acreage to something a little bit more manageable. Now, people don't want to downsize in quality. They want to downsize in terms of getting rid of the green bits perhaps and the stairs, and that's the motivation. So that to me is probably the biggest paradigm shift in Australian real estate in, say, the last 10 years. There are other trends like the exodus to affordable lifestyle, people moving to regional areas or to smaller capital cities from the big cities that are very expensive and congested. But that growing trend towards attached dwellings is very significant. I think in Brisbane, really well placed to prosper with that, and we're seeing it showing up in the numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting trend because traditionally long term, looking in the rearview mirror, most investors would have a definite preference for a house and land. And yet in the last 2 years here in Brisbane, units have outperformed. Those attached dwellings have outperformed. And that's at a median value level. Certainly on the ground, we've seen some areas really surge ahead of others in terms of that attached dwelling space. But I think it's also important for investors to understand that there will be more units coming to Brisbane in certain locations. Right now, it's very difficult for developers to bring that new supply to the market because of cost. Long term, we may see more supply start to come, but investors really need to understand where is that supply likely to come based on the Southeast Queensland infrastructure plan, regional plan, also zoning requirements. But our heritage overlays and our character residential overlays also prohibit development in some parts of Brisbane. So for investors to sort of layer all that up, it's going to give some insights into the areas potentially where units won't have a significant oversupply long term, but there may be other areas where they could be at risk, in the future if more supply does come.
And we've certainly seen in the not so distant past that Brisbane did have an oversupply in certain inner city suburbs of apartments. That's all been soaked up. And right now, as you say, it's very hard for developers to cost effectively build major new apartment projects. Only the luxury market seems to stack up at the moment. So for the short term, there's not a supply issue, but longer term, I would urge people who are thinking about apartments to think about the type of product and the location. And I always recommend something a little bit more boutique rather than the big projects in those areas where you can end up with oversupply. And you're basically, perhaps if you're buying in one of those buildings, you're buying something that's pretty similar to 200 or 300 others in the same building. But there are areas of Brisbane where you can get something with a little bit more individuality and character. And in good suburbs too, and that's something we may touch on a little bit later in the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Terry, the infrastructure side of it, I know we've got the Brisbane Olympics coming, the influence then on the property growth in the region. Obviously, those big infrastructure projects will have an influence. Are there any tips or anything you can give the listeners on areas that you think might be areas that are a bit underrated, that might benefit from things like that?
In terms of the Olympics, I mean, we struggle to recommend the areas that will be influenced because we don't yet know where they're going to build anything.
Yeah, that's a very fair point.
Almost 4 years after Brisbane was awarded the 2032 Olympics, they still haven't decided where they're going to have the major venues.
Yeah.
Hopefully, a new state government will get on top of that very, very soon because time is going by. But at the time that Brisbane was awarded the 2032 Olympics almost 4 years ago. There was quite a lot of research published on what impact does that have on property markets, and by studying other host cities over time, not just for Olympics, but other major world events. And the conclusion was that there is an impact on real estate. It tends to happen in the lead up more than after the event. And that makes sense to me because it's the big infrastructure investment that really generates. And also there's a lot of focus on the city in the lead up. There's lots of comings and goings. But also that research indicated that it's the suburbs close to the big venues, and there's going to be many venues. It's not just one major venue, and it's going to be also Sunshine Coast and Gold Coast as well. But it's the suburbs close to the big venues that tend to have the biggest uplift. Of course, right now we don't know what those suburbs are, but we can assume that they're going to be fairly inner city in nature. It might be an upgrade of the Gabba, or it might be something new in some other part of inner city Brisbane. But areas like South Brisbane, West End, I think are certainly going to be feature in some form with the Olympics. So there's going to be new infrastructure there in an area that's already got many appealing features.
So the answer to that is probably somewhere between Nathan, the Gabba, Hamilton, and Victoria Park.
But right now we can only speculate until they give us some confirmed decisions, and then we also need to hesitate because being politicians, they may change their minds 12 months time.
That's a very fair response, Terry. I'm going to just change the pace a little bit. I want to talk about what you raised very early in this episode, and that is that Queensland as a whole has, tremendous investment opportunities for some people. How would you say regional investment opportunities in Queensland stack up against Brisbane in terms of growth potential into the future?
I think regional Queensland stacks up very well. I mentioned earlier that report we do this time every year, and we're currently working on the 2025 edition of Rising Stars for Canstar. And but I've done the rankings, and you're the first to hear this. But
an exclusive.
What we do is I've modelled this on the State of the States report that CommSec publishes, where they use a range of metrics to rank the economies, the 8 state and territory economies. And I always follow that report because I do see a correlation in their rankings and what happens with real estate markets. They've ranked South Australia and Western Australia as the leading economies, and Queensland, the top 3, consistently over the last several years. And those are the states and the capital cities which have outperformed. So this ranking system, 5 metrics, and then we aggregate them. And what I've come up with is Brisbane number 1 in the nation for 2025 and regional Queensland number 2. Wow. Now, I may be accused of locational bias, given that I'm a Queensland resident and have been for a long time, but really that's what the research has shown. They all stack up very well in terms of rental demand and low vacancies. Sales activity is very strong. Partly that's driven by that exodus to affordable lifestyle trend. Investors are focusing more and more on Queensland now. Western Australia has been a big focus, but I think people are pivoting, having understood that Western Australia and Perth is past its peak and it's time to look elsewhere. Infrastructure spending very big, both in Brisbane and also in regional Queensland. So it's very strong on all the metrics that we use to arrive at these rankings. I think regional Queensland is the best regional market in Australia. It's got more big, strong, growing regional cities that offer affordability, good rental yields, and prospects for growth than anywhere else in Australia. And that's why I think it's so appealing for investors. And we're now seeing quite frenzied markets in like Rockhampton and Townsville. And people need to be a little bit careful about diving into those markets because they're very competitive. But there are other options throughout regional Queensland, really good places that I think long-term are going to perform for people. And they offer this wonderful quality of affordability, which is increasingly hard to find in Australia.
Very good to hear that Brisbane has ranked at number 1 again. We did not know that result prior to recording this episode. So, I'm really pleased to hear that your research is pointing to Brisbane even ahead of regional Queensland. I just hear so much out there. There's so much noise about some of these regional towns across Queensland. And I feel that there's a high volume of buyers agents Australia-wide that buy into a particular market, and the sheer volume of clients that they might be putting into a particular market might actually drive price points for a certain period of time. My concern is what happens when the investors stop investing in some of these markets, if they are sort of tipped and driven by volume from interstate investors. And of course, it's something we often talk about on this podcast, and we educate our clients upon in relation to making sure you're buying in a location that still has home buyers that can afford to pay what those investors are paying, because you don't want to sort of tap out from an affordability perspective. But we're starting to talk a little bit about data, and you mentioned data in your response just earlier. Is there any sort of data that everyday investors might be able to tap into that will help them to, pick a location or have confidence in a location that you could direct them to?
Yeah, well, we are obviously very data driven, and I would urge investors to be more influenced by what the data is saying rather than what the media is saying, or where the herd is stampeding to.
100%.
Yeah, there's been so I think a lot of people are going to regret some of their decisions that polling into the Western Australian markets just because they heard there's a boom there, and without thinking too clearly about what they're doing. But something that we try to do with our business is provide a portal that is almost, we're working towards creating a one-stop shop. It's not quite there yet, but we're pretty close. It's a work in progress where you can get all the data you need to rank markets. As I said earlier, we're very influenced by infrastructure, existing and new, and the spending on new infrastructure can be a major game changer for all kinds of markets, particularly regional ones. A relatively small regional city can be hugely impacted in their property markets by the construction of a $1 billion hospital, for example. And right now, Bundaberg's got one under construction, so does Toowoomba. And we like that kind of infrastructure because not only does it create a lot of jobs in the construction of it, there's even more jobs in the operation of it. And so there's a lasting impact. And we saw that with the Sunshine Coast with its medical precinct a few years ago, and there's ongoing impact from that. It really was a game changer for the Sunshine Coast. Relatively small regional cities like Bundaberg and Toowoomba will be also impacted by their big hospital projects that are now happening. So those are things to look for. Things that have a lasting impact, a real impact, by bringing new people to live and work in a regional city long term, and therefore long term demand for real estate.
Mm. I like the approach that you take, because it really is a top-down approach, Terry. It's not just, based on this particular measure, days on market, or, this particular measure, property listings. I mean, you're taking a really holistic view, and I'm sure that you consider all of those metrics that I'm talking about in assessment. But taking that top-down view really helps you understand the broader economy, not just what's happening right now in the data, but it's the broader economy as well as the individual data sets, and you're combining it all to predict which areas are likely to outperform. Am I correct in that assessment?
Absolutely right. And if anyone gets one of our location reports that we have on the website and included in our top 5 and top 10 hotspots reports that we publish and update regularly, they will note that it might be a 15 or 18 page report on a particular location. There's not actually that much about the property market. It's all about the economy. It's all about the demographic trends. It's about the jobs that are being created. There's a big section at the back listing all the major projects we think are going to have an impact as they roll out. But there's obviously a section on prices and rents and vacancy rates and all of that relevant property information. But the vast majority of each report is about the economy and the infrastructure stuff that's happening, because that's really that term that everybody likes now, the secret sauce really lies in all of that. The property data tells us what's happened recently in that market, doesn't necessarily inform the future.
Mm.
Terry, when we talk about the timing in the market, and we get this, a lot of people will come to us and talk to us whether we should buy now, whether I should wait. a friend at a barbecue told him that the market's changing and they should wait for a bit longer for certainty in the market, things like that. For investors, do you think now's a good time for Brisbane? Because obviously ranking number one, and obviously off the back of last year being ranked number one and holding that position, with all the things that you look at, is now a good time for people to be investing into Brisbane, you think?
I think it is. Brisbane obviously had a very good year in 2024, but I think that's at the beginning of something rather than Perth is very much at the end of its cycle. And that time, that opportunity has well and truly passed for now. But Brisbane, I think, has got a lot more upside, and its cycle is going to be extended by the Olympic impact and the infrastructure spend that has to follow to prepare for that. What might have been what you might call a normal cycle is going to have an extension to it. So there's like a 5 or 6 year horizon for people to look at for Brisbane heading towards the Olympics. It's not the only factor, and I think there could be a tendency to overrate it. But I think that taken even before the Olympic decision came along, Brisbane was already spending big on infrastructure. It already had big population growth. It was already benefiting from that big demographic trend. So the Olympic is just a bit of icing on that very substantial cake that already existed. So I think it is a good time to be considering Brisbane. And I also think that I think people tie themselves in knots trying to get the timing right. And I think there are too many wait and see people out there who want to wait and see what the Reserve Bank will decide next month or what the result of the upcoming federal election will be, all of which for me is pretty much irrelevant to a long-term decision that you should be thinking about in investing with real estate. If you're ready to go, you've got all your ducks in line, you've got your finances sorted out, you believe in the future of Brisbane, don't muck around trying to get the timing right. Take action. It's about getting the right property in the right location within the greater Brisbane area. That's what the focus should be.
I like, sorry, I just want to jump in. I like the way you say the long-term investing. I hear too many people wanting to make this fast money in property. And when you talk about long-term investing, that's exactly the way we talk and the way we look at property as well.
Yeah. Like I like looking at what really, really successful people have done and are doing. And that includes people who've got nothing to do with Australian real estate sometimes. I find myself quoting Warren Buffett a lot. As you know, one of the richest people on the planet. I'm interested in the fact that he's well into his 90s. He still goes to work every day. Successful people never retire. They love what they do. They keep doing it. But there's many wonderful quotes that were really about share market investing from a global perspective, which is what he does, but they apply to real estate. And he was asked, what's your favorite hold period for a good asset? And he said, my favorite hold period is forever. And I like that because I think that's the kind of mentality you should bring to real estate. I think it's not a process of buying and selling. It's not about trading. It's about accumulating good assets and keeping them, putting them on the shelf. And Buffett says, I don't care if they close the share market for 5 years. I didn't intend to sell anything I owned anyway. I buy it and I keep it. That's the secret of his success. And I think it's the way to approach property investment in Brisbane and anywhere. Yeah.
The power of long-term compounding returns as well. And I think that this microwave society where we want things instantly, it really distracts us from that long-term opportunity that actually exists. If you buy the right assets and then you sit and you wait, time will do the heavy lifting, and you will find that the older you become, the more wealth you actually create by waking up, doing what you do during the day and sleeping at night, because those properties are working and compounding in their own way behind the scenes.
Yeah. I was once interviewed for a podcast called If You Could Go Back in Time, What Advice Would You Give the 25-year-old you? And my advice, and very simply, was never ever sell, because when I think about the things I owned, and they were all in Brisbane because that's where I started out, and I wish I still owned, the ridiculously small sums of money I paid for them back in the 1980s and what they're now worth. I think that's one of the most important learnings I can give to anybody starting out with investment. Buy good assets and keep them and just accumulate.
Very fair advice. I want to just sort of circle back to what we've been teasing our listeners about throughout this episode, and that is specific property types, especially here in Brisbane. We've pointed out that unit market, that attached dwelling market. It's outperformed the single dwelling or the house market for the last 2 years across our city. Do you see that segment of the market continuing to be more lucrative in the short term and long term future, or do you think this is just a blip on the radar?
No, I really don't think it's a blip. I think it's a long-term trend because I think I understand what's driving it. Affordability is part of it, but there's a lot more to it than that. It's about lifestyle. A lot of people like that lock up and leave lifestyle, the low maintenance lifestyle that an apartment can provide. It's also increasingly, I'm finding, about security, safety and security, because that's a concern to people. There's so much media about a crime on the streets, and I mean, I personally know people who've had home invasions and been burglarized, their homes at ground level, and that's a motivation too. It's also about location. Quite often you can achieve a really good location in a really good suburb affordably through a unit or a townhouse as opposed to a house on a block of land. So there's lots of reasons driving, lots of different cohorts. We talked about the downsizers. That's a very powerful and growing force in the market with people just wanting to get rid of, as I said, the green bits and the stairs and have not a reduction in quality, but a reduction in kind of maintenance and workload as you get older. So lots of reasons why that is going to be a major trend. I think Brisbane's got some lovely options for people wanting to pursue that. I like looking at suburbs where there's a big disparity between the median house price and the median unit price. And Brisbane's got some great suburbs, like one that stands out for me is like Ascot, Clayfield, and sorry, the third one is, can't remember. Anyway, those really.
I was going to say there's probably areas like New Farm, even huge price disparity between what you buy for a house and what you'd buy for a unit in the same location.
But in suburbs like Ascot and Clayfield, you're probably typically paying $2 million or more for a house, but you can buy small units and, 500,000-600,000. I can't attest to the quality of those products, but I do note the disparity. It's a way to get into a really good suburb, really close to the action, great lifestyle elements for a pretty affordable price. A good way maybe for young people to start out as a first step. Brisbane does have opportunities like that throughout, even down in some of the more affordable areas like Logan City or up in the north in the Moreton Bay region. For those who are really constrained by how much they can spend, they can get into unit markets very affordably. They may be concerned that they're not going to get any capital growth, but when you look at some of the numbers that have been produced in the last few years in suburbs like Logan Lee, those kind of suburbs, which, some people may fear to tread. It's not exactly upmarket real estate, but as I often say to people, ugly real estate grows in value too. If it's well located, it's got all the features that people look for close by, then people will buy there. People will want to rent there, and prices will grow.
Terry, interesting when you talk about it, and I probably get it. I'm getting a bit older as well. And I hear that when you talk about units with security, location, lifestyle, and that maintenance, when we look at the weather we're having here in Brisbane at the moment, the amount of rain we've got and the humidity, my hedges are going like crazy and I don't want to get out and hedge my garden. So this is what people start to think. It's the way it is. People downsizing, people living in lifestyle and that low maintenance. People don't want to spend their weekends having to hedge their gardens and mow their lawns and do all those types of things. If they're living in a location that's great, they can go and have a coffee or they can go and have a drink down the road at some microbrewery. And they're the sort of things that we're probably seeing here as well, how Brisbane is changing and developing that way in the lifestyle.
And if you're buying in an area that's got lots of lovely green space, like New Farmers, you mentioned, got these wonderful big parks that people can easily access for free. You don't actually have to have the green space in your backyard. I think, the concept of what used to be the Great Australian Dream with the backyard, the quarter acre block, that's changed a lot. And, as the city grows, I think people will be accessing those sorts of green spaces in their neighbourhoods rather than in their own backyards. And that's another driver for demand for attached dwellings.
Interestingly, we've invited you onto the podcast. This is the Brisbane Property Podcast. Obviously, we specialise in the Brisbane market. There's been two big pieces of information that you've shared with us that we did not know prior to this recording. And the first is that you've ranked Brisbane as the number one spot once again for property investors over the next 12 months. And the second, I took a risk in asking you what is your perspective on the unit market in Brisbane, because we are quite bullish on the unit market, because we've seen in person on the ground and through the data what's actually happening in that space. And yet you've reconfirmed as a hotspotting expert that market and the growth that we've experienced in that segment of the market doesn't appear to just be a blip on the radar. And in fact, this is a more sustainable, outlook and projection for that segment of the market now as well. So I appreciate you sharing those insights, because I wasn't sure whether your perspective was the same as ours in regard to the unit market in Brisbane, but it appears that we're on the same path. And as local residents, we've probably seen the change happen over many, many years. I grew up in Brisbane. I've really seen how we've moved from a country town to a developing city, and we've got a lot more growth to come. And so I'm seeing that in real time, and I'm experiencing that in real time. And that's why we're able to really advise property investors in terms of where those opportunities do exist, based on not just the data, not just the macroeconomic information that we have available to us, but based on our local expertise and experience in terms of, where we are in a cycle of developing into a large city.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Brisbane has come on in leaps and bounds in terms of what it offers. It really is a great city to visit these days. I live outside of Brisbane, but I love, a weekend in Brisbane. There's so much on offer and so many different parts of Brisbane. I love South Bank. And everything that it offers, but Brisbane increasingly has those lifestyle elements that people will come to and enjoy. It doesn't have, look, it reminds me a little bit like Melbourne. I love Melbourne as a city, and it doesn't have the big harbour that Sydney's got. It doesn't have the Sydney Opera House, and Brisbane doesn't have those icons either, but it just has a lovely lifestyle offering, so many lovely things to do and to spend your time, great places to eat. The river is a major feature, which Brisbane has learnt to maximise at long last. And that's a really important part of why the Brisbane market is thriving, I think.
We actually had some clients come into us yesterday in the office here, and they're from Melbourne. And it's interesting listening to people from outside, and they said, oh, we love it. The people are just so friendly, and it's so much more laid back, and it's relaxed, and the traffic's not as bad. It's easier to get around. When you hear people talk like that, you hear that lifestyle, and people are attracted to Brisbane. And these guys, they're looking to relocate back up to Brisbane here from Melbourne. And that's one of the factors they love about it.
I will say at the time of recording, those clients are up here in the Christmas holiday season, so traffic is nowhere near as bad as it normally is. But there was a report that was released just in the last week or so, which highlighted the fact that Brisbane is the city that is ranked number 10 in the world in terms of the worst traffic congestion, and we are the most congested city in Australia in terms of traffic. And look, I'm sure that there's many people that live in areas around Greater Brisbane trying to commute into the CBD by car along some of those major, car transport networks. They do become congested, when everyone's back at school and everyone's back at work. But right now the city's quite easy to get around by car.
But also, the powers that be are aware of those factors, and there are infrastructure projects well underway that are going to partly at least deal with that, like Cross River Rail and
that's right,
the metro, and there's more to come in that regard, and more has to come. That's one of the things that has to happen for a city that's going to host the Olympics. The transport infrastructure has to be upgraded. the rail link to the Sunshine Coast coastal areas has to happen. All those things need to happen now. So the Olympics is going to be a catalyst for all sorts of good things that are going to benefit property markets in southeast Queensland.
Terry, look, amazing information that you've shared, and actually great information for us. Obviously, when you talk about Brisbane and the unit market and things like that, it makes us personally feel happy because we've got some investments in that side of things. So very happy on that side of it. People wanting to get to know more about your business and things like that, obviously they can reach out to hotspotting.com.au.
Yeah. Absolutely, and we have a lot of good information that's available for free. But we also have, for people who want to get a little bit more, we have a range of different memberships, and even our lowest level of membership allows people to access the investors portal. There's a hub there where you can get information on every suburb and town in the country, every individual property in the country. Key in the address, and it'll bring up sales history and illustration, and also give you a value estimate for those who are trying to get a feel for what things might be worth, calculators, all sorts of things. And as I say, we're working towards creating a one-stop shop for people, because right until recently, you've had to go to all these different places to get vacancy rate information over there and price data over there, and it can be quite time consuming. So we're trying to save people time by having it all in one place, hopefully.
Good on you, Terry. I think it's a very valuable resource for people that are out there that don't understand how to gather data, don't understand where to start, and they're really wanting to get ahead and have some strategic advice behind them to ensure that they are making a really good selection when it comes to working out where they're going to invest their money. So we really appreciate you joining us again on the Brisbane Property Podcast, Terry. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing all of this valuable information with our audience again today.
No worries at all. As you can probably perceive, I do love talking about real estate. I do like talking about research and how it applies. And all of this stuff is important, isn't it? It's about shelter. It's about people's lives and their futures. And so I think it's important work that you do and what we do. And I love being involved in it.
Likewise, we look forward to continuing to collaborate with you, and we'd love to invite you back on again in the future for a further update to see whether, what we've discussed today actually is going to be the results that we do see in the months that do lie ahead. Because, of course, no one has a crystal ball. We have no certainty over the future, but it's always good to look at the data, look at the fundamentals, and make some predictions on what we think is the most likely scenario based on the information available to us at the time that we're having this discussion.
Yeah, and Terry, I know you like talking about property. I think, like most of our listeners, I love listening about it, listening to people talk about it with the information that you've got, the experience you've got, and the data and everything as well. So, look, thanks again for sharing that, not only with us but with our listeners. And again, let's chat again soon, and hope to get you back on the podcast. So,
yeah, I'm happy to do it.
Thanks, Terry. Really appreciate it. As usual, I will let Melinda wrap things up. So thanks very much for listening. Thanks again, Terry. And we'll talk again next week, everyone. Thanks very much, and bye for now.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us once again on the Brisbane Property Podcast. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have and you value this information, please share with friends and family. Hit that subscribe button if you are watching on YouTube, or leave us a review if you're watching on your favourite or listening on your favourite podcast player. We look forward to speaking with you again next week. Until then, have a fabulous week, and bye for now.